Well, happy Friday to everybody. How you doing today? I've got a few things to get through today, so we're going to get right started. First thing, Marina's Toybox requested a re-sing of the song on Tuesday's video. So for those of you that are have perfect pitch and trouble with songs, I'm trying to get the glare off my glasses here. There we go. You might want to plug your ears at this point, but for Marina's Toybox, here we go. Little Jack Frost, get lost, get lost. Little Jack Frost, get lost. You don't do a thing but put the bite on my toes. Freeze up the ground and take the bloom from the rose. So little Jack Frost, get lost, get lost. Little Jack Frost, get lost. There's lots of cold feet, all the lovers complain. You turned off the heat down in Lover's Lane. The bench in the park is all alone in the dark. So little Jack Frost, get lost, get lost. Little Jack Frost, get lost. Oh, little Jack Frost, go away, go away. And don't you come back another day. There's lots of cold feet, all the lovers complain. You turned off the heat down in Lover's Lane. The bench in the park is all alone in the dark. So little Jack Frost, get lost, get lost. Little Jack Frost, get lost. There you go, Marina's, I want to call you Marin, I don't know why. There you go, Marina's Toybox. Hope you enjoyed that. If you didn't, well, my apologies. Here we go. All right, next thing on my agenda for today is I am going to start a challenge. But it's not going to be just any challenge. I'm going to call this a shotgun challenge. It's going to have a few rules. So, how this is going to work is I'm going to shout out 4 channels today that I know watch my channel, so they'll get the challenge. And the challenge is that they will then shout out 4 channels that they know watch their channel, but they cannot shout out the channel that shouted them out. So in other words, the 4 channels I shout out should not shout my channel out, because then we could just end up going around in a vicious circle. See that? Vicious circle. Anyway, and we don't want that. What we want it to do is go out like a shotgun blast. If you're not familiar with shotguns, when you first fire it, the pellets come out at the end of the barrel tightly clustered, and the further they travel from the end of the barrel, the wider they spread out. So that's the idea here, is that these shoutouts will spread out. See that? Spread out as they pass through cyberspace. So my shoutouts today, my first one is, and I've shouted out these channels before, so don't go, wait a minute, he's repeating himself. Yes, I am repeating myself. So my first challenge shoutout is to it's Adventures with Mark. It used to be Magnet Mark, but he changed his channel name so he could do more diverse things to Adventures with Mark. So Mark, you are now challenged to shout out 4 channels that you know watch your channel and will shout out 4 other channels. My second channel shout out is Burning Sands Exploration. So Cindy, down there in Nevada, staying nice and warm in your farmhouse. Here's something for you to do on those cold and chilly days when you have a few minutes between taking care of your animals. 4 channels to shout out that you know watch your channel, and we'll shout out 4 more channels. Next is Marina's Toybox. Okay, Marina, I sang you the song, did you a favor, so now you got to do me a favor. So Marina's Toybox, shout out 4 more channels that you know will shout your channel out. And last but not least, my favorite Friday funny guy, Bits of Real Panther. Sean, I challenged you on the 3 things we don't know about you, and you didn't follow through. So I'm hoping you'll follow through on this one and shout out 4 channels that you like and that you know watch, and we'll shout out 4 more channels. So that's the challenge. And now the moment you have all been dreading for the last 7 days, the Groaner of the week. Well, there's 3 rather eccentric but wealthy fellows who enjoyed hunting, who got together and decided that they were going to do something different this year for their hunting season. And so they flew up to the northern wilds of Canada to a lodge and decided they'd go hunting from there. Well, once they got there, they discovered that the cost of hiring a guide to take them out hunting, which is the wise thing to do in the wilds of the north, was very expensive. And so they decided, being the intelligent and highly trained people they are, one was an engineer, one was a psychiatrist, and one was a bishop in a church. I won't say what denomination. You can leave that to yourself. But all very well educated, highly intelligent people. They thought, we don't need a guide. We've got a GPS unit. We're good to go. And so that next morning they packed up their hunting gear and off they trekked into the woods. Well, what they didn't realize was a couple of hours into the woods, the GPS unit came unclipped off the engineer's belt, fell into the snow that they were trekking through. And it wasn't until later in the day, when they had no luck hunting and decided it was time to head back, that they discovered their problem. Well, at first they thought, well, we'll just follow our footprints back. So they started doing that, started following their trail that they'd made in the snow back. But the weather changed and dusk started to fall and it started to snow heavily. And it wasn't long before, with a little bit of wind, their tracks were wiped out. And so as they're stumbling around out in the woods, starting to get worried because it's getting colder and dark, they're wondering how they're going to survive the night, because even though they're all avid hunters, none of them are really outdoorsmen or woodsmen, and so don't know the tricks of the trade to stay alive and well in the wilds. So they're stumbling around in the woods. They think they're going in the right direction, but as most people who think they're going in the right direction usually find out, they aren't. And as they stumble through the woods, hacking their way through branches, trying to remember landmarks if they'd seen them before or not, they come upon an old cabin. And they think, oh, well, this may not be the lodge, but hey, it's our salvation. So they go up and they bang on the cabin door and no one answers. And then they realize there's no lights on in the cabin, so they think, well, let's try the door. Well, there's no lock on the door, so they go into the cabin and shut it. And they kind of stumble around, and one of the guys, who's crazily enough brought a cell phone with him, even though it's in the middle of nowhere and there's no cell reception, uses the flashlight feature, and they kind of look around the cabin. They find a couple of oil lamps and some matches, so they get the oil lamps going, and they realize as they look around that the cabin is just one big room and has a table and chairs at one end, kind of rustic, and a bed and that at the other end, and some shelves with some supplies, and just basic, really. But right in the dead center of the cabin is a pot-bellied stove. But the strange thing about this pot-bellied stove is it's not sitting on the floor on a hearth. It's hanging in the air. And there's all this baling wire going up to the rafters. And here's this pot-bellied stove suspended about 4 feet off the floor. And so they think, well, that's our source of heat, so we need to get this going. So they've managed to find some kindling and some firewood stacked over against the wall, and they find some paper to scrunch up, and they get a fire going in the pot-bellied stove. And before long, the cabin's starting to warm up, and they're starting to feel like, hey, they might just survive after all. Well, they find some cans of beans, and they manage to fix some beans on top of this pot-bellied stove. It's kind of a reach, but they manage to do it. And so they're sitting around eating their baked beans, and the engineer says, well, I don't know who this cabin belongs to. He says, I really have to admire them. They must have a good handle and understanding of thermodynamics. He says, because most people would have placed the pot-bellied stove on the floor, which would have done an adequate job of heating the cabin. But by suspending the stove in the dead center of the cabin, both end to end, side to side, and top to bottom, he's allowing the heat to radiate out to the maximum and really taking the best advantage of the heating he has. This is, he's obviously a very smart individual and understands thermodynamics quite well. Well, the bishop says, oh, what are you talking about? He says, this is obviously a spiritual thing. This man that lives here is obviously a very spiritual man. He's probably a religious hermit, and that's why he lives out here by himself. And this is his symbolic way of lifting fire up to God. He says, we all know that, in many churches we use incense, we use many things, and we send our prayers and praises up to God with the raising of our hands. And so this man is very spiritual and has symbolically lifted fire to God as a thank you. Well, the psychiatrist is just shaking his head and says, you guys are nuts. I don't know what's wrong with you. For pity's sake, obviously this fellow is lonely and, just has trouble dealing with society, and that's why he's out here by himself, but he's obviously very lonely. Imagine living out here all on your own. He says, no. He lifted the stove up like this so that when he gets really lonely, he curls up on the floor underneath it, and it's like re-entering his mother's womb, and he feels the comfort and the love of his mother, and he takes comfort in that. I wouldn't be surprised at all if I caught him in here doing that. He'd probably be sucking his thumb. So that's what it is. It's a psychological thing. It's his way of returning to the womb. None of this garbage about what was that again? What did you call that? Thermodynamics? Yeah, there's none of that stuff. And he says, it's certainly not spiritual. He says, look around. Do you see a Bible? Do you see anything else religious in this place? You're crazy. It's totally a psychological problem here. Well, they settle down for the night and they sleep. And the next morning they get up and they're trying to decide what to scrounge out of this guy's supplies for breakfast. And suddenly they're stomping on the porch and the door bursts open. And in walks a grizzly old trapper, and he's got a deer carcass draped around his shoulders. And he stops dead and he looks at these guys and kind of goes, hello. And they said, oh, sorry, we hope you don't mind, but we got lost in the woods and we happened to stumble upon your cabin, and we thought it was our only way of survival. And the guy shrugs, drops the deer carcass on the floor, takes off his hat and coat and hangs him up, and he goes, no, I don't mind. He says just kind of a rule of the wilderness. If you need to survive and you come across a house or a cabin, he says, it's perfectly legal. You won't be charged with breaking and entering. It's a matter of survival. So he says, no, I'm glad you found me. He says, if you didn't find this cabin, he says, there's not much around here. He says, you probably would have just ended up being statistics. More hunters, hikers, lost in the wilderness, disappearing with no trace, never to be heard from again. So it's a good thing you found my cabin. I'm glad you did and made yourselves at home. He says, here, let me start getting breakfast going for you. And he goes outside and comes back a few minutes later with a side of bacon and some eggs, and he obviously had a refrigeration unit or some kind of storage unit outside somewhere that they were unaware of. And pretty soon pulls out a old orange crate that's been reinforced, and he's standing on it, and he's cooking bacon and eggs on top of this pot-bellied stove. And finally the bishop can't take it any longer, and he says, so tell me, sir, he says, we were discussing your stove arrangement last night, how you have it suspended in the air. And he says, I, being well trained in these matters, realize that you're obviously a very spiritual man, and that placing the stove as you did is your way of lifting up praise and thanksgiving to God and honoring all his blessings that he's given you. And the trapper kind of looks at him funny, and before he can say anything, the engineer jumps in and says, oh, I told him he's nuts. Don't listen to him. He says, I get it. He says, you probably, before you became a trapper and came to live out here on your own, you're very well versed and trained in thermodynamics and understand that by putting your stove where you have, you get the best heat radiation and the most out of your fuel. And so it's the most efficient place to place your stove. So he says, don't listen to him and all his spiritual mumbo jumbo. He says, I get it. You know your thermodynamics. And the trapper goes, well, and before he can say anything, the forgot who the third guy is. Psychiatrist, bishop, engineer. So it's a psychiatrist jumps in and says, don't listen to them. He says, I understand you. He said, if you need to talk, I'm here for you. I'm a trained psychiatrist, and I understand how lonely it must get out here for you. And you're probably feeling very anxious right now, having the three of us here, because you obviously don't like society and you don't like being around people. And so that's why you live out here by yourself. And he says, and I really, truly do understand why you would lift your stove up like that, so you can curl up underneath it and feel like you're back in your mother's womb and feel comforted by that. And if you suck your thumb, don't worry about it. Well, by this point, the trapper's gotten down off his box, and he look at these guys. You guys are all crazy. No wonder you're lost in the woods. Where on earth do you get this stuff? What are you talking about? And the engineer said, well, if it wasn't for spiritual reasons or psychological reasons or for good engineering reasons, why on earth would you have your stove suspended in the middle of the air like that? And the trapper shakes his head and he says, I had lots of baling wire and not enough stovepipe. Oh, Oh, Groaner. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this Friday's shoutouts and Groaner. Take up the challenge there, guys. So we'll be looking forward to watching your videos. So Burning Sands Exploration, Magnet Mark, Marina's Toybox, and Bits of Real Panther. The trigger has been pulled. The blast is leaving the barrel. It's up to you to move the pellets along. Alrighty, until Tuesday, when we will be doing something interesting on our baking and cooking show. Take care, God bless, stay safe, and have an absolutely wonderful weekend. We'll see you on Tuesday.